Welcome back to your second lecture for the CompStud Stress and Coping class. Today we are going to be talking about coping. So last week we learned all about stress, and this week we are going to begin talking about the various ways that we try to alleviate that stress, or the term we'll be using today is coping. Your reading for this week discussed a variety of ways that individuals respond to stress, and not really all of these strategies, as you'll notice, were positive. For example, the majority of participants really talked about ways that they deal with stress by talking to friends or family members to cope. This is a strategy that we'll later call social support and really investigate in the readings for the class. But while other strategies were less effective as managing stress, like drinking or potentially using drugs. Even the most reported strategies of watching TV, reading, or listening to music can have mixed outcomes for coping, and it really depends on how we use these behaviors to cope. So if used to reduce the cortisol levels and relax, some of these strategies can be quite effective, like watching TV. But if they are used to escape the problem that's causing the stress, so maybe you're watching TV or listening to music to avoid studying for your final exams, then these strategies may add to your stress levels, making them ineffective. And that's a lot of what we'll be talking about in this lecture. This leads to an important point when talking about coping, and that's not all strategies work the same way for everyone, and not all strategies can be applied to all stressful situations. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And this just really recognizes that coping is a complex process, just as we learned that stress is a complex process, and we begin to recognize the complexity of coping as we review these different perspectives and definitions of coping that were presented in your readings for today. So let's get started looking at those. The first perspective was looking at the individual kind of ways that we cope with stress. So just as we saw in our chapter on stress, with coping, there are different approaches or perspectives. The chapter that you read for today or this week talks about the individual and relational perspectives. And then next week, we're going to talk about the communication approach, so the communication perspective to coping. To begin, the individual perspective views coping as a process that can change over time and in different contexts. So this definition is unique in a variety of different ways. First, it says that coping, or it highlights the importance of the context for coping, as I mentioned earlier. In other words, the particular stressful situation shapes our coping efforts. One important way that this occurs is through the appraisal process, and we really talked a lot about that last week. Remember, I talked about primary appraisals and secondary appraisals. And so you'll remember that cognitive appraisals are evaluations of whether a particular situation is threatening to our well-being and our perceptions of the resources available to manage that. And so specifically when discussing stress, the primary appraisal is important. Our perceptions of the threat as being not that big of a deal, or as being a challenge we can overcome and grow from, or even being an extremely harmful situation really is going to influence kind of how we feel and how we cope with that stressor. When discussing coping, we are really focusing on secondary appraisals, or our evaluations of the various strategies and resources that we have available to us to cope with a stressor. Additionally, secondary appraisals involve our perceptions that we could change or do something about the situation, that we have to accept the situation, that we need to know more information before we can act, or that we have to hold ourselves back from doing whatever we want. So there are a lot of different things that we need to think about when we are considering secondary appraisals. The context is extremely important in influencing our primary and secondary appraisals. So let's look at an example of this. Let's consider the chronic stressor of a chronic illness such as multiple sclerosis. An individual with MS may view the stressor of the disease as being very easy to cope with while at home, but maybe harder to cope with while at college. This could be because while at college, the primary appraisal of the stressor is much more impactful. Specifically, college itself comes with a lot of stress, as many of you indicated in your discussion post for last week. And managing a disease like multiple sclerosis, in addition to the normative stress of college, may be viewed as being much more threatening than when the individual was in high school. So considering secondary appraisals, perhaps the individual has more access to resources such as the doctor they're familiar with, the understanding and social support of family members and friends, and the time and energy to manage the symptoms of MS while at home, but not away at college. So in this example, we see how the context, whether we're managing MS while at home versus at college, could greatly influence the cognitive appraisals of that process. The definition of coping from the individual perspective also treats coping as a neutral concept. So as opposed to labeling a coping strategy as being strictly bad or good, or we use those terms, your chapter uses the terms maladaptive or adaptive. In other words, whether a coping response is effective or ineffective really depends on the person, the type of stressor, and the type of outcome sought after. So referring back to my earlier example of watching TV as relieving stress, this can be an effective coping strategy if your goal is really just to escape from the stress of the day and to not have to worry about your upcoming finals and trying to relax for a couple hours. But it can be really ineffective if you're watching TV instead of spending the weekend studying for your finals, and instead you're binge watching Netflix. The second can result in not getting the rest that you need, maybe not allowing yourself to balance your studying with relaxing, which can have a negative result in terms of your performance on your finals. The next kind of characteristic of this perspective is that coping may change over time. So as a stressor unfolds, we may need to change or adapt our coping strategies. For example, your efforts to manage academic stress in your freshman year may be quite different than how you manage that stress in your junior or senior years. This is likely in part because you have changed as an adult, but also because your academic stress is likely different. Unfortunately, it's often more demanding in those later years, and that may necessitate different coping strategies. Finally, the resources that you have available to you may be different from your junior to your senior year. For example, you may have closer social bonds in your senior year than you did maybe in your earlier years of college, or you were aware of more resources that the university has to offer for coping, or you may have even more knowledge about the best ways to study and prepare for big projects and tests than you did in your freshman year. Or maybe it's all of these things, right? So the coping process can really change over time. And finally, coping efforts may be influenced by individual or cultural differences like biological sex, gender roles, socioeconomic status, cultural values and beliefs that may influence your cognitive appraisals. And those are many of the things that you read about in your chapter. So that really talks about the individual perspective. So let's take a look at the relational perspective. When we think about the relational perspective, this perspective argues that most often coping efforts exist outside of the individual, and that has an effect on others in their social network. So the relational perspective to coping has primarily been applied within the context of families and romantic partners, but the primary ideas can be applied to a number of other types of relationships. So essentially what this is saying is that when a person or a family relationship is affected by a stressor, the individual works to manage the stressor, but because of the interdependence of the relationship, or the fact that my behavior affects other people that I'm in relationships with, these efforts are going to impact the others closest to us, whether it's our family members, those close friends, roommates, romantic partners, etc. Similarly, the individuals within relationships can work together to cope with a stressor. Thus, relational partners may need to coordinate coping efforts to manage stress effectively. So let's examine this principle further. Let's imagine that your roommate recently broke up with their significant other, and it was a really nasty, tragic breakup. Your roommate has been held up in the apartment, they refuse to go to class, engage in social activities, and basically do anything other than sit on the couch or their bed. Their primary method for coping with the stress of the breakup is to binge Netflix, eat pizza, and drink. The individual perspective would argue that these coping strategies, whether negative or positive, are employed by the individual and impact only the individual. But the relational perspective would suggest that while yes, your roommate is employing individual coping strategies, perhaps as opposed to more relational focused strategies such as communal coping, which we'll talk about later, these coping strategies or behaviors are also affecting those close to your roommate. For example, your roommate, they may not be helping around the house as much as they normally do, or further, maybe your roommate's making a huge mess using their coping strategies. Or maybe you're in the same class or working on a project together, and your roommate's strategy of ignoring their schoolwork may also be negatively impacting you. So in other words, because you are in a relationship with your roommate, you have some level of interdependence. Their coping strategies are likely to also affect you, even though they don't necessarily involve your active participation. Extending this example, the relational perspective also suggests that people in relationships can cope with stress together. Here, we see that even though you are not going through the breakup, you are not the person that got broken up with, you may help your friend by making them shower, get up for class, get out of the house by taking a walk with you, and these efforts to cope with your roommate's stress happens within the relationship and involves your active participation. Thus, this coping strategy is relational in nature. So that really, summarizes the relational perspective. Next, we are going to talk about coping strategies in general. And so when we think about coping strategies in general, we can look at some of the different types of coping that we will be talking about in this class. So until this point, we have been discussing the process of coping. However, coping research also examines the influence and effectiveness of particular coping strategies that are used to manage stress and protect us from harm. These coping strategies are normally classified into three groups: the property or form of the coping strategy, the focus or function of the strategy, and the level at which the strategy takes place. So the individual or relational level, things that we just talked about. We will discuss each of these groupings in the following slides, and additionally, the final 4 weeks of this course are going to examine the specific communication-based coping strategies that are salient in the communication coping literature. So let's look at the forms of coping. When examining the form of coping, we can determine if the coping effort is an active one, or in other words, does it confront the problem head on? Or is that strategy avoidant? Does it engage in reducing the tension in more indirect ways? These two forms of coping create three general coping strategies. The first is active behavioral. These strategies are overt behavioral attempts to deal directly with the problem, such as actively confronting a situation, exercising, seeking out social support, communal coping, or attending to instrumental needs of the situation. In other words, they involve actively engaging in discussions about the problem, sharing meaning, seeking information, negotiating, and catharsis. Active behavioral strategy. The second strategy is active cognitive strategies. These strategies are efforts to manage how we appraise the stressor or the event. These can include strategies such as reframing or reinterpreting the situation, something that we'll talk about next week, maybe accepting the situation as it is, returning to religion, like praying, reinterpreting your feelings, and exerting kind of self-control over your thoughts. The final strategy is avoidance. Avoidance involves attempts to avoid confronting the problem, such as hiding information from our partners or from ourselves, or to reduce the tension indirectly by behaviors such as eating, smoking, binging Netflix, or taking it out on other people. While this approach is sometimes popular, it also has many critiques, especially from communication scholars. Scholars interested in communication and coping argue that avoidance is problematic because it is often difficult to determine whether a particular behavior is approach or avoidance oriented. For example, do we seek support in order to confront a problem or to take a break from the problem? And it leaves out other forms of coping that do not easily fall into one of these categories, such as observation. Therefore, we can turn to the function of coping to help clarify some of these issues. Okay, So when we examine the functions of coping, we are distinguishing coping strategies according to how exactly they are intended to help. Here we have four major strategies. The first of which is problem-focused coping. Problem-focused coping occurs most frequently when we appraise conditions as amendable to change. Problem-focused strategies can be similar to those used for problem solving, such as defining the problem, generating alternative solutions, weighing the alternatives in terms of their cost and benefits, and choosing among them, or acting on the situation. Again, this is a really good strategy for problems that we see have the ability to kind of be fixed. But there are some stressful events that maybe can't be fixed. In that case, problem solving coping, not your best strategy. The second strategy is emotion-focused coping, and these emotion-focused coping strategies are prevalent when we appraise a situation as out of our control. That is, we have decided little can be done to modify the harmful, threatening, or challenging environmental conditions. These strategies can include cognitive efforts such as avoidance, minimization, distancing, or selective attention, and behavioral efforts such as binge watching TV, venting, or exercising. So again, we're not actively trying to solve the problem as we saw in problem-focused coping, but we're changing maybe our perspective and our attitudes to kind of our cognitive or behaviors at kind of regulating our emotional response to the problem, because the problem is really out of our control. I mean, any problem-focused coping efforts would be kind of not effective. The third function of coping is meaning-focused coping. And meaning-focused coping refers to cognitive strategies we use to manage the meaning of a stressful encounter and plays an important role in the primary appraisal process. So again, referring back to those appraisal processes. During meaning-focused coping, an individual may draw on their beliefs, such as religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, values, and existential goals, so your purpose in life or guiding principles, to motivate and sustain coping and well-being during difficult times. This coping strategy includes efforts to reframe the situation, perhaps using humor, both of which we will talk about in more detail next week. The final function of coping is relationship-focused coping, and this includes two major strategies, active engagement and protective buffering. These will be discussed further on the next slide. So looking at the different levels of coping, when we think about the coping process, we can think about the different levels at which we cope with that stressor. The first is solitary coping. We refer back to our discussion on the individual perspective here, and this level of coping relates very closely to kind of just dealing with the problem ourselves. These strategies include things like confrontive coping, such as expressing anger, distancing, such as making light of the situation, self-control, which would involve keeping feelings to ourselves, potentially seeking social support, accepting responsibility, escape avoidance, such as drinking, planful problem solving, which would involve making and following a plan of action, and positive reappraisal, such as finding new faith or reappraising the situation. Although we enact each of these strategies at the individual level, relationship and family researchers recognize that they can affect those around us, like we said in the relational perspective. For example, expressing anger may be directed at a loved one. Executing a plan may require the assistance of others. And maintaining kind of the relationship integrity involves bringing loved ones together to keep the relationship alive and well. This kind of borders the next strategy or level of coping, which is social coping. Social coping includes one of the major communication-focused coping strategies we will discuss in this session, which is social support. Social coping perspectives examine how social support can help us in times of need. For example, by offering comfort or emotional support, reassurance of worth or esteem support, expressions of connection, which are involved in network support, information and advice, which would be classified as informational support, and tangible assistance or new perspectives, which we call appraisal support. All of these types of social support we will be talking about later in the semester and are really, really important for the relational perspective, but also as we think about reducing our stress levels, something that you will hear about in your video discussion for this week. Finally, communal coping is a process in which a stressful event is substantially appraised and acted upon in the context of close relationships. So again, thinking about that relational perspective and really taking on a communication perspective here. In order for communal coping to occur, one or more of the members of the relationship must perceive the problem as our problem, as opposed to just my problem or that's your problem. So while this level of coping appears to be social, it's uniquely different in how people come together to claim the problem as their own as a means of coping. So we can look back to our example of the friend who just broke up with their romantic partner, and when you are helping your roommate get dressed and go to class, if you are framing it as this is our breakup, this is something that we need to deal with, we are engaging in communal coping. But if you are just thinking about how those coping efforts maybe influence you or maybe how you're helping them out with their problem, that would be referred to more as social coping. So that summarizes the content for kind of our introduction to coping. Again, we're going to be talking a lot about coping this semester. It's one of the major focuses of the course, and we'll be looking specifically at some of the kind of communication perspectives in the communication model of stress and coping next week, as well as really focusing on some of those communication focused coping strategies that really align with some of these conceptual ideas that we talked about today. That is all for this week. I look forward to coming back to this medium next week.